All right, good evening, everyone. This is the Affordable Housing Ad Hoc Committee of the Common Council, starting our meeting at 6:01 today, February 20th. First, for our roll call, we have Councilmember Dunn, Councilmember Edie, Councilmember Seed, Councilmember Nadelsky-Eichner, and Councilmember Young. And we are joined by our colleague, Councilmember Lopez, who is not on the committee, but obviously is very welcome to participate. So we do have a quorum, and I think we should go ahead with our business this evening. Michelle, do we have anyone for public participation?
Appears
Oh, sorry. Pardon?
Yeah, that somebody has their hand up.
Okay, I just realized we should do, I think we actually have the acceptance of the minutes before public participation. So let's do that real fast and then we'll move to public participation. So did anyone have any additions or corrections to the meeting minutes for our meeting last month, January 23rd? Okay. Seeing none, can I get a motion to accept the minutes? All right, thank you very much, Ms. Dunn. So all in favor, please signify with raise your hand or aye. All right, terrific. Looks like we have 5 votes on that. So I think the meeting minutes are accepted, and we can move on to public participation.
Sure. We have Diane Lauricella.
Great. Thank you so much, Ms. Lauricella. As always, if you can please state your name and address for the record, and then you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Diane Lauricella. I live at 21 Little Fox Lane. I hope you can hear me. I am in a bathroom in a restaurant.
We hear you just fine.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to briefly state that, again, I'm very pleased that the city has an ad hoc affordable housing committee, that you have done a study. We have an action plan. I wasn't able to speak at the last time you met to talk about the action plan, but I did want to say, because you're going to discuss next steps, I'd like to really see a targeted approach, for instance, as 2 examples for our next steps to consider putting together an inventory of those commercial sites that could be turned into housing. Commercial meaning office space, abandoned buildings, but especially even the mall, quite frankly, like they're doing in Trumbull and Danbury. And have a multi-phase plan going out 5 or 10 years, because some of these commercial properties, like a mall, probably will not cease to exist, but could be a potential site. And that allows for incentivizing investment. Secondly, on the issue of ADUs, I do agree with my friend and colleague Diane Keefe. I have spoken for several years, especially when we were modifying the ADU laws, that we need to seek more modification, because in the single family area, unless there is a convincing public outreach program, many single family homeowners who are seniors do not understand how they might be able to remain in Norwalk should they convert their homes. And there is, to my knowledge, no true marketing approach to let them know about attached ADUs. Of course, I am a big proponent of detached ADUs. And so I just ask there be a more aggressive approach. It's great that we finally have this action plan. It took us a little too much time, quite frankly, but I know we did our best, but we could do better, and we have to be more aggressive and target. So I thank you for your time. Good luck tonight. I will read and see what you decide are the next steps. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lauricella. Do we have anyone else for public participation?
I don't see any hands, but if you'd like to speak at tonight's meeting, please use the raise your hand feature. Don't see any others.
Okay. So at this point, then we will close public participation and move on to our first agenda item. And our first agenda item tonight is to talk about the next steps on the Affordable Housing Action Plan. So I really appreciate everyone's participation in the joint meeting last month. We will, correct me if I'm wrong, Michelle, but are we formally adopting the plan at the next council meeting? Or is,
The plan is for it to go to planning and zoning next on probably their first March meeting, and they're gonna formally refer it over to you guys and then hopefully appear on one of your agendas following that March meeting. So we'll just have to match up a date.
okay, so that realistically, that may mean that we're at our second meeting in March. Regardless, as everyone saw, hopefully, were fairly minor, I think, recommendations. And so I think that we all can sort of work with this at this moment in time as if it is a pretty near final. And I think that we all feel the urgency here, right? This is a really pressing issue in our community, and we want the action aspect of this plan to really be, I think, a key component here. That said, one of the things that's interesting about the plan from my perspective is that very few of these items are directly items the council is responsible for. And so one of the things that I wanted to talk about tonight with all of you, and I've spoken to Steve and Michelle about this as well, is sort of the role of this committee and the ways in which we can serve as a force for implementation, as a way to keep people on task and follow up on issues, and really bring in speakers, do other things to kind of help move these items forward. Even though we may not actually have direct authority on some of them, I think we have a lot of capacity to continue to keep tabs and see what we can do, and what other people can do, and sort of check in on that. So as part of that process, I wanted to open the floor in the first instance, to the committee, for questions that you may have for Steve or Michelle about sort of priority items and ideas and thoughts you have about priority items. Um, who should we be talking to? Who should we be inviting to come to the committee? Are there particular issues that jumped out as low hanging fruit that we want to make sure are on the correct person's radar and follow up on that? So I wanted this, and I obviously have lots of thoughts, never short on them. But I wanted to really gather and make note of the committee's thoughts and recommendations there so that we can really work with staff, and keeping this process moving. So let me open the floor to begin with to the rest of the folks on the committee. Ms. Young.
Thank you, Chair. And maybe I missed this, but we've been talking about this for so long. And I think the city is going through so much change and growth right now. We're really behind the 8 ball, and we can come up with a plan that by the time we're at the point of maybe doing something and creating some housing, again, land is quite sparse and scarce in the city.
Yeah.
So what kind of timeline? I mean, I think we need, this is urgent to me. I mean, I don't want us to put a plan together that sits on a shelf because we've got no land, right?
Right.
And then I do appreciate what Ms. Larcella said. I think we do need to do some sort of, planning this out in the next 5 years. What's it going to look like? What does it look like now? And I know we've talked a lot about that, but I think I don't want us to miss. We've already missed so many opportunities.
Totally.
And what is this plan? I mean, I know this is what we're talking about, and I'm just thinking of so many things right now, but I feel like we are so far behind the 8 ball that this housing plan is going to be very, very sparse. And the other issue that I think we need to talk about, and we might have touched on, and I don't know if this is the right place or not, but it's on my mind, is that money in lieu, that account, right? So there are all kinds of ways that we can help people move forward into housing, whether we're able to provide them with down payments, all those sorts of things. I don't want us to miss the boat on that, right? Because we do want people to be able to get into housing, whether it's buying a home or we ourselves are doing that. and looking at the structures that we own. For instance, the Columbus School. I think we talked about all this stuff. There's so much to it. I'm just throwing that out there right now. It's just on the top of my head because I fear that we're not going to be able to do much. I hope that's not the case, but
I hear
land
you.
is getting
No, I
more
hear you completely.
expensive, right? Land is getting more expensive by the moment. And the plans that we have right now, it seems like we're talking about micro units. Like there are all these little things that are going on, but we're not really talking about homeownership.
Yeah, well, so a couple of things that, and I will obviously open the floor, but a couple of things that come to mind that I just want to say to folks in response to that. So one is that at 6:45, we're going to transition to a conversation about the trust account.
Okay.
Because now we need to establish, so, and Michelle sent around the ordinance as a
Mhm.
reminder to everyone, we need to establish that committee and get them working. So, and Steve will give a report on how much money we have. I don't know. So that piece, we can move forward. We start that tonight. We were waiting on the plan, second thing, one of the questions that came to mind for me in looking at these plans is, there are a number of these that have to do with needing staff availability to do this. We have a whopping 5 days before our budget cap vote. Should we be making, and should we as a committee be making a push on a request before the budget is finalized to get a staff member in to carry forward a number of these things? So I think that is one question for the committee tonight, right? There are a number of things that are identified in here as short-term or medium-term, but are dependent on staff capacity to do it. So, and if we don't put a budget request in now, obviously we can't do that for a full another year. So I did want to raise that, following up on your point, Darlene. I mean, in this question of like, how do we move this forward? That is something we could do now, potentially, at least to try. And then the third thing.
But
Yeah.
to your point, if we don't do that now, then what does this look like, right? There's just some things that really need to happen.
So, right. So I think, that then becomes I mean, I talked to Steve and Michelle about this a little bit, right? Like, we can invite to this committee, we can invite the Norwalk Housing Authority to come in and say, these are the items that were assigned to the Norwalk Housing Authority. How are you able to move forward on them? How are you moving forward on them? Give us an update. What do you need in order to accomplish that, right? We can do the same thing for the redevelopment agency. So I think that this committee can serve that sort of coordinating and encouraging function. I think we should talk tonight. We should hear from Steve and Michelle about a number of the things that are assigned to planning and zoning and what their plans are for moving those forward. So as we can model, that process, right? I also think, and one of the things, Steve and Michelle can talk to, is we have talked about planning a community forum for May to help circulate information on what already does exist, right? I mean, there's a number of pieces in this action plan about making information available, about existing state plan funding plans, about existing, city funding options, really making sure we get that out there, but potentially also trying to identify, advocates, private, people who might be interested in some of these public-private partnerships, right? We need some forum to kind of help bring them together. So I think that gives us a little bit of a target goal of sort of, we want to potentially be able to show some progress by May, which could hopefully light some fire. But I'm with you very much, Darlene. I feel very much the same. And the bigger the issue, the harder it is to see. As you said, Columbus School is probably the largest piece of property that I saw on that map. And I think that's a conversation that needs to be had publicly, right? What are we doing with it? When is it going to be? It's supposed to be, the students are moving into the new school in September, right? So what's the timeline after that happens? Do we have a planning process in place? I think these are fair questions.
And then who makes decisions on then what happens to those pieces of property that the city owns, right? And then what's coming through planning and zoning as far as folks wanting permits to start building? Like we're fighting almost against each other if we don't kind of have a broader vision or a focused vision and Am I making sense? It's because it,
Total sense,
Can I ask a
right?
question? Like, what is the goal?
right,
Like, I understand that we have all these numbers, like, how many people are cost burdened and stuff like that. And me personally, I'm probably one of them. I pay more in housing than other things, but my salary is high enough that I can pay for food as well. But what percentage of the population do we need to get to what percentage? Like, what's our, our bellwether of we're
what's our goal? You said it. What's our goal? In 10 years, what do we want to see? 10% housing? You're right.
I don't know what we're trying to get to. And one of the things that's interesting to me, this is an aside, is that I was reading the article about like Darien just lost their Title I funding because less than 2% of their population of students lives in poverty, where we have 75% free and reduced lunch in our town. So what's the level that we're trying to get to? And at what point do we do some other things as well? Like, I'm a big proponent. We really need to go after the ECS funding because it's dramatic, the difference between what we get and Waterbury gets. So the financial implications of all of that. So I realized, not to take all, but we do need 2 and 3 bedroom units. And a lot of that has to do with people in Section 8 housing. If you have a boy and a child, they can't be in the same room, which means you need additional bedrooms and able to go into that apartment. So that's a different kind of demographic. Whereas I would bet, going back to the Darien thing, they do have what I think like 5% affordable housing, but if only 2% or less children are in a level of poverty, they must have a lot of seniors living in their affordable housing, if that makes sense. Right?
I'm sure that's the case.
Yeah.
Yep.
So what
Well-
our goal so that we can, we're looking at a budget in our Board of Ed that we're heartbroken about not being able to fully fund the way we'd like to. How do we make sure that we can support the schools with what we have and create that the living conditions all together, and what's sustainable, and I'm sure that there's statistics and things for that to have a healthy city, financially.
Right. No, I mean, absolutely. I mean, and you'll notice in here that there's a whole section, right, that on federal and state advocacy, right? I mean, that is an entire section of this plan because the reality is that a lot of this is far beyond our control, right? This has in part to do with lots of decisions being made by other municipalities, and other things like that. So I think part of it for this committee is what are we willing to commit to in terms of talking to our legislators, talking to other legislators, are we willing to commit to giving testimony at the State House? I mean, I think that is a question. This is very much a clear part of this recommendation is that we need to be able to advocate. We need to be advocating at the state and federal level as well. But I don't, from my perspective, we can't, not do things locally because we need to also do that advocacy.
I'm not suggesting not doing it.
No, I know you're not. I'm just saying that's part of it.
When you talk about, being cost burdened what does that mean? And what would like us as a goal, what percentage of our population do we want to be cost burdened? Because I would guess that we have a lot more, and I don't know whether, and I would bet it's since the most recent demographics were done, because I think that we looked at the Board of Ed budget, the amount of free lunches, the money that we have to come up with has dramatically increased. So how do we support them? Because there are obviously, I would bet, more people that are cost burdened than there are now. So what do we want to get down to? What, in a perfect world, what percentage would be cost burden?
I mean, I don't, and Michelle and Steve, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think that the plan had a goal articulated in that way. I think that the goal was articulated in terms of building the number of additional units that would be needed to create a market where there would be sufficient units such that prices, would go down and people would not be overall cost burdened. I don't know if there was a percentage goal. Maybe Michelle and Steve, you could comment on what the,
Maybe Steve, do you know, are there areas or places that we can access that have statistical information about what creates a healthy city? Because I know there are statistics about, home ownership versus rentals. If you have 50% rentals in a city, it's, it makes the city less healthy. There is a specific number statistically, and where do we find that kind of information so that we can develop good goals?
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that top of my head, but we can certainly research that before your next meeting and give you some, some numbers and some data based on what we've seen other places for sure.
right, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought that there is a goal. I thought that the plan includes the fact that the assessment is that we need 8,000 additional units over the next 10 years to be able to meet the housing demand in Norwalk. Am I wrong about that?
Well,
I got to go back if it's just specific to Norwalk or, I mean, the other part of what the plan kind of hints at too is, regional need to help in this regard too. So not just Norwalk providing housing for everybody. So, New Canaan, Darien, Wilton, those guys also kind of chipping in more than they're doing currently.
Yeah, let's be honest, we all are well aware that they
But there
need to
were-
chip in.
There were 250 empty rentals, which means that they were probably not affordable, which means that somebody who's cost burden can't get in there. So in some ways, maybe we need to figure out how to lower that. I don't know. But again, unless you have a goal that you're trying to reach, saying you
Right.
need some more units, but yet we have 250 empty apartments. Why is there the mismatch there?
I could be wrong, but 250 empty apartments doesn't seem like that many to me. That seems to me like a pretty standard. You're always going to have some emptiness while you're in the process of turnover, someone's in or out. I actually thought that seemed like a remarkably low vacancy rate, for a market our size to have that few empty. I thought that was actually just speaking to how tight our market is. Johan, you've been patiently waiting.
Thank you, Chair. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, no, to Heather's point, and looking at the plan, I think just like with any plan, I see that there's the matrix of principles, goals, and actions. So from what I gather, the way I interpret this is that now that the plan's in place, and the committee will kind of move on to the next step, which is to decide which ones are the priorities, which ones are the goals that they want to pursue. And a lot of that is going to have to do with, talking to the city, different departments to see what's the capacity, what they think is something that's achievable. And it's going to be like a reiterative process, and you go back to the table until you kind of have 3 or 4 goals that are feasible. And then you go from there, kind of developing implementation process. So that's a kind of way that I interpret it. And then second, for Steve and Michelle, I was wondering, is there a centralized repository that has current vacancies? And if so, does that also include waiting times? Is there anything like that?
For market and affordable?
For affordable, mostly for affordable.
No, we typically, Michelle, correct me if I'm wrong, is if we get inquiries, we usually direct them to the individual managers for the affordable units. But I don't think there's like a central, we talked about trying to keep that updated, and it was beyond cumbersome for us to kind of track
yeah.
what's available at any one time, because the units, it's I would say monthly emails to probably 30, 40 people to try to get them to respond and update a spreadsheet. It just didn't seem practical for us.
Okay. Yeah, just something I was thinking about, because if ideally there was something like that in place, I think it would allow people to really be able to access and see what's actually available. I know a friend of mine, she just moved in from the city, and one place told her that she had a waiting time of 4 years. Another place, there's a waiting time of 2.5 years, and since she's a single mom, and So that's the idea or the question stem from that. But okay, all right, understood. All right, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Well, and I will just note that E4, under, I think, planning and zoning is a recommendation to streamline the application process and create a single waiting list. So again, I think that's a question of staffing, right? And again, whether one of the things this committee wants to do is make a recommendation for, you know, an additional staff person to assist with affordable housing. And again, if we were to do that, where would they sit? Which of these many tasks would we want to assign them to? And, you know, the ship may have sailed on that, but on the other hand, it hasn't entirely. And so one question is whether we, you know, want to try to do something on that in the next few weeks. Jalen, I think you were next.
Um, yeah, I had a just opinion kind of thought too with like the affordable housing is that it's a tricky situation because like we have to make an investment in it, but also with that investment we want to make sure that we're not kind of hurting affordable housing in other ways where if we're raising taxes too much then you are raising rents and making it kind of less affordable for people. So that's why I think it's important for us to kind of analyze the cost burden that's going to be on the taxpayers in the city, because we don't want to, like, affordable housing is like, and it's in the study, and we had this conversation before, it's not just one answer. Affordable housing is going to be, and it means different things to different people. But I think we have to be mindful of the taxpayers, and we don't want to be adding to the burden in different ways just to kind of push one initiative forward. And I think kind of just my opinion on the staff person, like just because I kind of hear, like you said, we got 5 days for that. And I think it's kind of just, I think it would be kind of rushed. And I mean, I don't know what other people think, but for me, it just seems like kind of late to be pushing that. But like I said, I'm kind of open to what everybody else thinks about that.
Okay. Johan?
Thank you, Chair. No, so just similar to Jalen's point towards the end about the staff person. I mean, I do think it's very late in the game, but conversations can still be had with the mayor's office and appropriate departments to see what their thoughts are. And maybe something can be worked out, whether it's internal or maybe they can't hire someone or they can, whatever the case may be. I think it definitely requires a conversation with the mayor's office and relevant departments thereafter to see, you know, what they think.
Right. And whether we're really, I mean, we just may not be ready to move that forward. It doesn't mean we're just not ready for a proposal for later in the year, or for a proposal, you know, for maybe an interim person, or for a proposal for next year's budget. But again, I also don't want to rule that out because we do still technically have time. So I think that's worth talking about. Steve and then Nicole.
Sure, thank you. So I think it doesn't hurt to put it in because at least you're putting it on the radar for the mayor to think about, even if they say it's not feasible this fiscal year, if, you know, funding becomes available down the road or it's next fiscal year, then at least you've kind of planted that seed. Just to give you a sense of, you know, we did talk with Nora the other day, kind of what Michelle and I are focusing on right now based on recommendations in the plan. We're hitting a bunch of like the low-hanging fruit right now. So we've already got one change into consideration of the zoning regulations to try to incentivize more workforce 2-family units. So that should happen within the next month or so. So I think that's a positive change right off the bat. We're also going to be pushing 3 different legislative proposals that we'll definitely reach out to you folks on. One has to do with, you know, in reference in the plan, trying to make home ownership a little more affordable in terms of condominium process, which is, and I don't quite understand the legislative barriers there, but that's hinted at in the plan. So we're going to seek some help on that, but that's like a big one we're working on. Second one would be related to something we saw in Massachusetts when they have properties that are delinquent in the tax sale, that they give the housing authority the right of first refusal to get those, you know, if they ends up going to auction. So that's something we'd like to see Connecticut adopt on a legislative level. It may not get much, but at least it gives the opportunity to look at some different properties. And the third one is sort of related to that, to housing, is that we've been talking about food desert issues in some areas of the city, thinking that there's New York has a tax incentive that they put in place for grocery stores to pop up in areas where there are no grocery stores. So that's something we're going to work on as well. So I think those three things we can probably work on within the next 3 months, and at least have some guts of a language to put together. And we'll definitely need some help getting it more in a formal setting. And the other item, which I think we'll talk about later, so Nora, cut me off if I'm jumping too far ahead, would be the forum that's recommended in the plan, which I think is actually could be a good thing. And we were talking about it a little bit today, Michelle and I, about how that could be structured and who it would be targeted for, bringing in different housing providers, whether it's Housing Authority, Pacific House, some other folks, Open Doors, and these are the kind of programs they offer. These who it's targeted for. Here's how you can get help. So each one of these groups that are identified gives a little presentation on who they are, what they do, and then we do a little Q&A, and then we have some breakout tables where all these groups can be around the room, and if people have very specific problems or very specific issues, they can talk to that staff person right then and there and get some help. Similar to how we structured the enforcement meeting last year or a year and a half ago, whenever it was, kind of same format, but targeted towards folks looking towards housing. So those are the things that we're working on. I think we can act on in the next 3-4 months. And then, things like what do you do about those city properties that are identified in the plan, and how do you build those out? That's a much more complicated question. Just thinking about your time on council, when you have properties that come up, city properties that someone wants to redevelop, thinking about areas at the train station, think about how long that process is on even small slivers of land. So wholesale redevelopment or, changing use on properties, it's not going to be a quick thing, no matter how soon you try to act on it.
Thanks, Steve. I think that's super helpful. And in terms of the things you're working on, I believe we also talked about the 80% AMI and considering some changes around people who are sort of just over that limit.
Yeah, I thought you would bring that up, but yeah, definitely one we're talking about. I think that Michelle is doing some research on that to see how other communities have tackled that. I think at the end of the day, what will probably happen, if that's a policy that the city is interested in, those units technically I don't think would count towards the 830G calculation that we provide to the state of Connecticut. So we're at say we're at 13.5% right now as defined in statute. That percentage would tick down ever so slightly. So I think that's just a policy question the city has to decide if they're comfortable with. We can put safeguards in place that at no point in time will we allow it to get below 12% or whatever that is. Michelle's also going to look at, with the existing individuals within the workforce housing program now, how many might be at that point where their income gets above that 80%, and will there be a big surge of people that could exceed that, and how would that affect our present calculation? So maybe we have another safeguard is, if you're above 80% but below 90%, you can still stay in the unit. It just won't count towards our workforce calculation, but it'll still be a unit that's rented at a reduced rate. So and I think we can have that language in place probably in 6 weeks to have something at least for everybody to take a look at and consider.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. Nicole? Councilmember Edie, sorry.
That's okay. I agree that we should put the request in for the staff person. I just feel like if you don't, and everything in the action plan was almost a challenge because of staff, that we're just going to keep going in circles. And I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
I have more stuff, but I'll let you finish the meeting. So.
No, bring up your more stuff. We've got, so I'd love to hear, more. I mean, I think this is the question, more priorities, more recommendations.
Yeah, I know we're going to come to a point at some time we're going to talk about the trust, and how that's going to work, but there's so many creative, ways to build housing. Again, I want to state, we're not talking about apartment buildings always. There are other things like townhomes and ADUs and other things that we would like to see done. I think if we start off on a small scale and build up, I think we can make more progress that way instead of trying to look at the big picture all at once and get overwhelmed, and then we don't do anything. I also was always wondering, can we do like I don't know what properties or what the city owns in Rowayton. I don't know how that works, but we never, I thought they're a part of Norwalk. Am I wrong about that?
They're very much part of Norwalk.
Isn't there
Yes.
something, right, that, if they have some things that can be smaller scale as well for affordability. And I'm mostly talking about middle housing when I say affordability. So really I'm talking about workforce is what, I will be concentrating more on. I know there's all different levels of housing that we need, especially senior housing as well, but that's what I'm going to be pushing for.
And I think the map of the city-owned property in the plan was incredibly helpful. I also think it is incredibly challenging because honestly, we own remarkably little. And most of what we own is parkland. And so I think that is going to be a really interesting conversation to have. You know, the remaining parcels that are identified here are limited, but I agree with you. I think that that needs to be sort of the priority, right? What can we do with them? And are there ways that we can get additional properties that are city owned? But yeah, I don't think in the map actually that the city owns anything in Rowayton. If I'm wrong about that, correct me. But I think because I believe even the train station is actually owned by the 6th taxing district, not by the city. And that's a whole nother, I mean, the taxing districts are a whole nother conversation, right? As to whether there is, options on that property as well. I mean, something that I have been giving a lot of thought to at the moment. I just read a really interesting short little piece. In New York, they have started building public housing on top of libraries. So when they do a library renovation, they don't just build the library, they build senior housing or other, workforce housing. And so, I think it's really worth thinking about as we're starting to talk about a renovation of the main library. Why not build housing on top of the library if we're going to do a big renovation there? Like that kind of dual purpose use of public land may be something we really have to consider. And I think gathering those kind of ideas, and one of the questions for me is sort of who does that idea go to, right? Like it's, and so I think that this committee can serve a little bit of that function for right now. If there is an idea, figuring out, who to get it in front of and start that conversation. Because affordable housing, I mean, one of the things that I really realize in looking at this action plan is that there is, we're in one of those affordable housing, much like sustainability, Councilmember Lopez, and I think your new staff member is really for the same reason, and this committee exists for the same reason. It is a problem that multiple departments have responsibility for, and that then results in nobody having responsibility for it overall. And that I think really does create a situation where it's hard to know sometimes how to move something forward or who to even talk to or make the proposal. So I'm hoping that that this committee will sort of do some of that work, while we consider other ways of kind of getting that more formalized within the city. So before we move to the Affordable Housing Trust,
Before you move on.
yeah, of course.
So the other question that I had was, in this report, it said that the prices of Norwalk rental units on the open market are not serving households making less than 83% SMI, so I guess this question's for Steve Kleppen. When we have developers building all these apartments, if only what is that, 17% of, the upper 17% can afford them, and we're providing tax abatements to the developers, is there something we can do in contracting with them or allowing them to do it, to say you have to maintain the, you know, we don't want to do, what do you call it, cost, to keep a cap on how much rents can increase during the time that there are tax abatements in place. Does that make sense? What I'm trying to ask?
Yeah, I think so. That would probably take a rewrite of a portion of the workforce housing regs because they're tied to the SMI. And so the SMI fluctuates annually, so it's not, and it's surprising how much that goes up year over year. And the other end of the spectrum is not keeping up with that increase. So yeah, that's a perpetual issue.
Salaries aren't going up. So I guess my question is, if they're only required to add what, 10-12% of
10,
affordable housing
yeah.
per unit, and 83% of the population can't really afford it, and we're providing all these tax abatements, it's really not serving our affordable housing needs unless we change. Do you know what I'm saying? I guess me personally, I don't want to add more tax abatements for a developer to only have 10% affordable housing if then the rest of them are gonna increase the rents, you know, double the rents the next year, and then even more people can't afford to live here. That's my concern.
Yeah, and I don't know if rent control is like a local issue. Seems more like a state issue, but I'm not positive one way or the other.
We are not permitted to do it under state law. So it would be something we would need to advocate for. And I think, again, is the kind of question, like, this committee as we get informed about this stuff, it would be a good thing to personally. I think it would be a good thing to advocate for. We don't have, but the state would have to grant municipalities the authority in order to develop a local ordinance that implemented rent control. And there have certainly been plenty of attempts at the state legislature to allow municipalities that authority, and they have been voted down. But it's certainly something we can and I think should consider advocating for. I think there's also a slightly different question implicated in your question, Heather, that I want to talk about in a second, but let me go to Councilmember Edie first.
Thank you. Just real quick though, but it doesn't have to be posed as rent control, right? Can't we just offer it as an incentive?
Well, so an incentive to do more workforce housing?
Yes, past the 10%. Yes, because I still don't understand that concept.
Well, and
So-
the life, you know, if you have a 7-year tax abatement and you're only keeping them affordable, the 80% of your units are only affordable for 2 years, and then they become $6,000 a month. You know, they're not paying into the tax. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
But Heather, to be very clear, they're not affordable for only 2 years.
Yeah.
So Steve, let me let you jump in on that.
Yeah. So the workforce units are in perpetuity.
Sorry, go ahead.
So, yeah, the workforce units are in perpetuity.
But what about the other 80-90% if they're only required to build 10% of what they've built to be affordable?
And those are market rate. So whatever the market will bear for those.
So again, 17% are I don't know, the numbers don't add up. And
I think
So-
the plan identified that there was an issue up to 83% of SMI, not necessarily 80. So one thing and I didn't talk about it earlier, we were talking about a way, it's kind of hard to regulate that because that 83% may fluctuate, someday could be 85, who knows where it lands. We were talking about a way to incentivize units between 80 and 90% SMI. So maybe we give you some kind of bonus or density bump or reduction of something in order to achieve that. But they wouldn't count towards the workforce units, but it would address another issue identified in the plan.
And does that look like tax abatements, or how do you do?
No, I mean, it could be taxed through a tax abatement, but we were talking about it more from just the zoning regulatory side.
Yeah, so I think there's actually at least 3 separate issues going on there, Heather. So one is the question of tax abatements and tax incentives. And we currently have the enterprise zone in place, which is what you're talking about, that gives the 7-year abatement. There is then a recommendation in this plan, and that's one of the things I wanted to talk about, because it is the one item in this plan that actually sits squarely with the council, which is to investigate doing a tax incentive policy based on section 1265B of the general statutes, which is a different tax incentive that to the best of my knowledge and current understanding, we do not currently use in Norwalk, but looks to me like it could be very valuable to us because it appears to allow for much more targeted incentives. So you could be much more specific. It's not everything that is built in this zone. It is something built that meets a whole bunch of criteria that we want. So that is something that I think this committee should investigate and make a proposal on that then goes through ordinance. So that's one of the things I wanted to talk about is sort of, can we move that works together forward in this committee? Because that is that is the one thing that's specifically for us. So I think that is something we need to do more research and investigate on. But I really would like this committee to tackle sooner rather than later. And I have some thoughts on that. And then the third issue you're raising is the question about whether 10% is enough. So according to the consultant, 10%, and Brian Bedoli has said this as well, 10% is all that the market can bear. I share your skepticism. Personally, I'm skeptical about that. So I think that is something that we, again, need to actually, I think would be a really valuable committee meeting to have the consultant, Brian Bedoli, and anyone else come in and actually walk us through why the claim is that 10% is all the market can bear and try to see some numbers. And maybe we ask some developers to come talk to us. We need to do our research on this because I think several of us share a skepticism about that. But also, I am not an expert in development. And so, the consultant did look at that question and that is in this plan. And the consultant did say that they believe that 10% is where the market can currently. So, but I think we have every ability to ask questions. That's our job. Let's do that. So I'd be all for having that be part of a meeting coming up if that's of interest to people. Yes. Okay.
Yeah. I think that's what I was saying. I would like to see it be much more targeted. And Steve, I appreciate, you talking about the food deserts. I think when you have especially transit or development areas with no food, people are going to have to drive to get their groceries. And I think that it's really great to see you thinking about planning for those needs for people too, especially people that may not have cars.
Right. And if we want to encourage people not to have cars, they have to be able to get food without driving, right? And as someone who used to schlep in college without a car, I used to have to schlep my groceries home in a backpack or on the bus, and it was really a pain in the neck. So I get that totally. So before we move on quickly to the trust, my hope for this committee is that we work on this question of the 1265B, that we invite the Housing Authority and the Redevelopment Agency as two of the other agencies that have a lot of tasks here to come and talk to us about those tasks. And in inviting the Redevelopment Agency, we can ask them about the 10%. So I heard some mixed things on making a recommendation about staffing for this budget. Should we at least try it? Or how do folks feel about that? I could certainly draft something to circulate to get people's thoughts, but it would obviously, if we want to try it for this budget, we need to move fast. So I'm curious as to people's thoughts on that. Ms. Dunn?
I would like to investigate grant funding, something like that. And I would also like to look at what our social service agencies that might have overlaps in that area already have before we ask for more money in the budget.
Yes, although I don't think any of this would be
Asks
something that a social service agency would do. This is for things like policy and, collecting data and, some of those things that are not functions that the social service agencies could provide. But although I do think there is one recommendation in here about coordination among the social service agencies, and I think community services is flagged already on that. But yes, but I think the grant point is certainly a valuable one.
What is the job description that we're looking for before we ask for the funding of it, would be my comment. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Mr. Lopez?
No, yes, that was actually my question, was what Heather just asked, like what would be the job description, like or what do you have in mind at the moment that this person would ultimately be doing? Just like a very general, idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the plan, you will see that probably 50% of them have to do with the need for staff to be able to implement them. So I think that the job description is probably taking the priority items from the action plan and recommending those as the sort of core functions of the staff member. But I do agree. I mean, in the short term, given that where we are, that could be. So why don't I work on pulling together something like that? And I can circulate it to the committee members to take a look and see whether it's something that we do or don't want to move forward, right now. And certainly it's something that, we can try to seek to fund through contingency or something else later in the year if we do, get a little more developed. But I also take Steve's point that, there's no harm in raising the question, also because it does lay the groundwork for the future if we do think there's a credible need. Okay, so any other thoughts for sort of immediate priorities for this committee for the next month or two? Let's say next 2 to 3 months. Other things that people would like the work of this committee to sort of tackle in the next 2 to 3 meetings. Okay. So on moving to our last agenda item, our second agenda item, folks may recall, just to level set friends, I know we have gotten some new folks. We did pass an ordinance establishing the Affordable Housing Trust, which utilizes monies that are collected when developers make payments to the city in lieu of creating affordable housing. So Steve, I don't know if you want to talk just very briefly about what the current balance is of that trust. And I think our next steps our next step is we need to appoint the committee that's going to expend those funds. But do you want to just quickly summarize what's in the Affordable Housing Trust and what the funds can be expended for based on the ordinance?
Sure, and I was trying to get the exact figure for you, and I'm not a big fan of the municity program, so I will get you the exact number. Michelle will email it out tomorrow. But it's a little over $2 million, I believe, at this point. Hopefully,
Right.
I'm not speaking out of turn on that. But the per statute, really, that the fund is supposed to go towards, construction rehabilitation related to affordable housing. I know the ordinance refined things a little bit further beyond that. One thing that is required in the ordinance, which I have a memo that I'll get out to you as well, and maybe if you have time on your next agenda, we can talk about that in a little bit more detail, is kind of what the criteria is, sort of like the application process where somebody can access those funds. So I had some thoughts and probably as many questions as thoughts on that, looking for guidance from this group on. So that would be kind of a dual next step. So that, as Nora said, there does need to be a committee that looks at this, but also how are they viewing applications and who gets to apply and under what criteria. So that needs to get put together as well before someone can actually request utilization of the funds.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Councilmember Young?
Yes, thank you, Steve. Just a comment. When we were starting this MLK corridor initiative, one of the issues we had and questions we did have was how much was in that account to be able to do some really good facade improvement and just doing some real improvements for homes in South Norwalk. And we never got that figure. So I'm glad to hear that it's quite a bit of money. but we never got that figure. And $1 million would have put us much farther along in our facade improvement program. So there are a lot of different creative ways to be able to have spent that money, but I'm glad to hear a figure today. But back in 2018, we didn't get that information. And so for me, just hearing that was a disservice to South Norwalk and the MLK Corridor Initiative, because we could have been farther along than we are right now. But hopefully we can put that money to good use.
Yeah, and the money would have to go towards affordable housing, so it couldn't, in some way, shape, or form, so it couldn't.
But I think
If
there
they
was a
cut
conversation that
themselves-
could have been had and that would have had a much greater impact on South Norwalk with the MLK Corridor Initiative that's still going on. And that the bulk of that initiative was because South Norwalk is growing and changing and improving. Homeowners that have lived there all their lives now should be able to reap the benefits of that improvement as it comes. Not after everybody has moved in and people have moved out, but for those who have lived there for decades to be able to experience improvements in their property as well. So that, but I'm glad to hear that there's a significant amount of money, not just for South Norwalk, because housing is an issue all over the city.
And I believe that we can use these funds to rehabilitate properties to help them remain affordable, correct? I believe that was one of the things that we put in there.
Yeah, I think part of that might be I think the units would have to be somehow like deed restricted affordable too, though.
Right, right. And that we spent a long time talking about this whole deed restriction issue, because that is part of the problem. If we're gonna spend, if we're gonna allocate city funds for it, we don't want it sort of be a windfall, became one of the questions. But so I think this is a fair point, Darlene, that we can, now that we are gonna get this actually up and running. So what we need to do to make this happen is that the council must appoint the members of this committee. So certain of the members are set by the ordinance, including a designee from planning and zoning, a designee from community services. 2 council members need to be appointed. So I think, if someone has a particular interest, let me know. Because we need to make a recommendation to the president and the majority leader. But then the other key thing that we need 3 members from the public. And so I'd like to make those recommendations as soon as possible so we can get this committee appointed. And the ordinance was very specific that they need to be people who themselves live in affordable housing. One who is a renter, one who is a homeowner, and I believe one who can be either. So if you can, and folks who served on the Affordable Housing Plan Committee obviously come to mind as a place to start for that list. But if you have other suggestions, I would super appreciate getting those in the next week. So we can again put forward a list and share with leadership and try to see if we can move them. I mean, ideally, I would like to move them for the first March meeting if we can, so that we can get this up and running. And as Darlene said, as Councilmember Young said, start getting these funds, start getting the process in place to get these funds out and figure out what we want to do with them. So again, it's someone who's a renter and someone who's a homeowner, but living in affordable housing, which I believe the definition in the ordinance is actually 60% of state's median income. So not 80%. So give some thought to who, might qualify, or who you think might qualify. And then obviously we'll have to ask them, and get verification on that. But that's why we need to get this moving. Thoughts or questions on that?
Chair, I think Councilmember Young has her hand up.
Oh,
no,
sorry, I
she
can't
took it
see.
down? I should take it down, okay.
Okay, sorry, couldn't see. Okay, so if folks will gather any suggestions on that, and then I will circulate some follow-up for the next couple of meetings. But also please, send me ideas on that. If there's if there's topics we want to get educated on, if there's conversations that we think would be valuable for the public, and so we want people to hear them, I think this is our chance to really, as everyone has said, keep this from being something that goes on the shelf, but really move it forward, start ticking off the boxes. I'm really grateful to Mr. Kleppen and Ms. Angeluski that were, planning and zoning can tell us, 4 or 5 things that they're already working on from this plan. And I want to be able to hear that from the other departments as well and kind of keep this moving. If we can get the low hanging fruit going, that builds some momentum. And I think that that's really important for not having this become one more study that we did that didn't go anywhere. Councilmember Lopez.
Chair, quick question. So this committee is envisioned to be how big, how large? You say, I know it's 3 from the public, and then the other members are going to be from what capacity?
So I think it's 7 in total. It's 2 council members, a designee from planning and zoning, and a designee from community services. So we spent a lot of time talking about who should be on it. And we ultimately decided, for instance, not to include redevelopment or the housing authority because both are likely applicants. And we didn't want to create a situation where so many of our committee members had to recuse themselves that the committee couldn't act. So there's 4 sort of set members and 3 members of the public.
Great, thank you.
I would suggest reaching out to Anna Vivian first, maybe. That's just my.
Reaching out to Anna Vivian to serve as the designee or
Yeah,
as for recommendations of committee members.
both, but she probably knows people that are very engaged at that point.
Okay, that's helpful. I'll certainly reach out to her and Lamont. It will be Lamont's decision to who he wants to designate, but certainly, Anna Vivian seems like a likely candidate, but it's a good suggestion to see if she has recommendations for potential people to serve. Councilmember Young, I assume that the MLK corridor project may also have generated folks who have, at this point, some expertise, and might be really, really good people to consider as well. All right, well, I did promise that folks had a hard stop at 7. We are at 7:03. Anyone would like to make a motion to adjourn? All right, thank you, Councilmember Dunn. All in favor? All right, thank you so much. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it. Michelle, thank you, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.